Sex changes everything for a woman, but not in the way most people think. What if the moment she stops seeking validation through sex, everything about her shifts, her energy, her presence, even the way the world responds to her? Imagine a woman who no longer measures her worth by desire, attention, or approval. She doesn't chase, she doesn't perform, she doesn't wait for permission. And the moment she stops, she becomes impossible to ignore. At first, it is almost invisible. She may not even realize it herself. She stops reacting to every compliment, every flirtation, every gaze. She stops bending her energy to meet the expectations of others. Where once she sought approval, now she simply observes. Every glance, every interaction becomes a mirror of reality, not a test of her value. And with every observation, she becomes stronger, more discerning, more aligned with her own essence. This is not abstinence, it is not denial, and it is not punishment. It is a reclamation. She is turning inward, taking back energy that once flowed outward to please, to be seen, to be wanted. And in that inward turn, something extraordinary begins to awaken. Her presence becomes magnetic, not because she changed how she looks, not because she learned a trick, but because she is whole. She is sovereign. She is unshakable. Society has always trained women to measure themselves through attention, through sexual approval, through performance. And when a woman refuses to play that game, people feel it immediately. It is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unsettling. Her energy does not beg, does not perform, does not seek. It simply exists. And that quiet existence carries a force that cannot be ignored. It draws attention, yes, but not the kind that can be controlled. It awakens curiosity. It awakens desire, not the physical kind, but the kind that comes from recognition of power and alignment. In the beginning, it may start as a question whispered to herself. Do I need to be wanted to feel alive, or can I find life inside me? That question is small, almost imperceptible, but it marks the first crack in the old pattern. Energy that once scattered outward in search of validation now begins to return. Compliments no longer inflate her ego. Invitations no longer define her choices. The pull of attention loses its gravity. She begins to measure herself not by how others see her, but by how she experiences herself. Not by desire received, but by energy cultivated. Not by approval gained, but by presence claimed. And in that cultivation, she begins to awaken a power that is rare, magnetic, and unstoppable. It is quiet, yet unmistakable. It is invisible, yet undeniable. And it terrifies anyone who still believes that a woman's worth depends on being chosen. This shift is rarely sudden. It grows in silence, in small refusals, in quiet moments of recognition. She notices the patterns she once followed, the scripts she once obeyed, the expectations she once internalized. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she lets go. She stops performing. She stops chasing. She stops proving herself. She stops bending her essence to fit a mold designed by others. And in that letting go, she finds herself. Every word, every glance, every ounce of energy that was once spent proving worth is now reclaimed. It flows inward, nourishing her, grounding her, awakening her. And the world notices, even if they don't understand why. The woman who no longer seeks validation through sex does not withdraw. She rises. She becomes presence itself. She becomes the reflection of possibility, showing that life, value, and power do not depend on being wanted. They depend on knowing your own worth. And as she continues to turn inward, she begins to see the patterns that once ruled her life. The compulsions, the distractions, the need to be noticed, the desire to be chosen, they all begin to dissolve. Where once she sought love and attention outside herself, she now discovers it inside. She realizes that the longing she felt, the restlessness, the small anxieties, were never about sex or men at all. They were about connection to herself. This awakening doesn't happen overnight. It comes in moments, often disguised as discomfort. She notices how empty certain interactions feel, how hollow approval can be, how fleeting desire really is. And rather than forcing herself to conform, she begins to experiment with absence. She pulls back, she observes, she listens. And in that listening, she learns something extraordinary. Silence is not emptiness, it is presence. Not absence, but clarity. Every day that she refuses to measure herself through sex or desire, her energy shifts in ways that are almost imperceptible to the world, yet profound. She becomes a magnet not because she is trying to attract, but because she is fully present in herself. And presence, when it is complete, cannot be ignored. People feel it. They may not know why they are drawn or unsettled, but they feel the difference immediately. She also begins to notice a subtle liberation in her relationships. When she no longer seeks validation, she no longer tolerates compromise that diminishes her. She does not accept attention that distracts, affection that manipulates, or intimacy that consumes without giving back. She learns to recognize energy that nourishes versus energy that drains, presence that adds versus presence that takes. And with that discernment, her life shifts on a level that is invisible yet undeniable. This is not rejection, and it is not isolation. It is sovereignty. It is claiming her own body, her own energy, her own desires, and deciding that they no longer depend on external confirmation. She is no longer a participant in the endless cycle of proving herself. She is no longer defined by others' pleasure, admiration, or attention. She becomes the authority of her own experience. And something remarkable happens. When a woman stops seeking sexual validation, she awakens a new sense of self-respect. The small compromises that once seemed necessary no longer hold sway. She begins to protect her boundaries effortlessly, not out of fear, not out of pride, but because she knows her own value. And this clarity radiates outward. Her interactions are no longer transactional. They are conscious, intentional, and authentic. She begins to understand that desire, when untangled from validation, becomes a tool of insight rather than a trap. Sexual energy, once scattered in search of attention, is now redirected inward. It fuels creativity, emotional depth, and intuition. She begins to see the difference between fleeting attraction and meaningful connection. She begins to understand the sacredness of her own body, her own energy, and her own attention. The world around her notices. It may not always understand, but it feels the shift. People are drawn to her, but not in the way they expect. They are drawn to her calm, her certainty, her energy that no longer begs, pleads, or performs. She becomes a mirror of possibility, a living example of what it looks like to exist fully in one's own power, to move through life untethered from the need to be chosen, desired, or validated. And this is where fear often appears, not in her, but in others. People are uncomfortable around someone who no longer needs approval. Some react with confusion, some with envy, some with attempts to control. But she does not respond with anger or explanation. She simply continues. She moves with quiet authority. She knows that her value is not determined by the reactions she receives. Her validation is internal, complete, and unshakable. She also begins to understand the importance of patience. Without the pull of external validation, she no longer rushes relationships, no longer seeks intensity for the sake of distraction. She learns to wait not in lack, but in fullness. She waits for energy that resonates, for presence that adds, for connection that expands. And in this patience, her world begins to shift in subtle, profound ways. Every choice becomes deliberate, every interaction measured, every boundary respected. And through this, she discovers freedom, the freedom of a woman whose worth is no longer negotiable, whose body, energy, and attention are her own, and whose presence becomes a force that cannot be ignored. She begins to see the truth of what many never understand. The moment a woman stops seeking sexual validation is the moment she becomes whole. Not complete because of someone else, but complete in herself. Her energy is no longer borrowed from desire, borrowed from attention, borrowed from approval. It is owned. It is sacred. It is alive. As she continues this journey, she begins to notice the shadows within herself. Carl Jung would call this the encounter with the shadow, the parts of herself she had ignored, denied, or repressed. These are the old fears, the old patterns, the insecurities that once drove her to seek validation through sex or attention. And now, in the silence of her own presence, she sees them clearly. But seeing them is not the same as being controlled by them. In fact, this is where transformation begins. She acknowledges the shadows, she feels them, and then she chooses not to let them dictate her life. She learns that the need for sexual validation was never about desire alone. It was about fear, about trying to fill a gap that could only be filled from within. Carl Jung taught that integration of the shadow leads to wholeness. And this is exactly what happens when a woman stops seeking external sexual validation. She begins to reclaim parts of herself that were lost in chasing attention. She takes back the energy that she had given away, consciously or unconsciously, and redirects it toward her own growth. This energy becomes power, clarity, and intuition. As her inner world strengthens, the external world begins to respond differently. Relationships shift. Interactions become intentional rather than reactive. She no longer tolerates manipulation or shallow attention. She no longer confuses desire for validation with true connection. Instead, she recognizes presence, energy, and authenticity as the new measures of engagement. This is also where patience becomes a key lesson. Without the pull of external validation, she no longer rushes to satisfy societal timelines or expectations. She waits, not in lack, but in abundance. She waits for resonance, for alignment, for energy that mirrors her own. And this patience is a form of self-respect, a recognition that her time, her energy, and her attention are precious. The power of this transformation is subtle yet undeniable. People may notice that something has changed, even if they cannot articulate it. She moves differently. She speaks differently. She loves differently. And this difference challenges the world because it disrupts the familiar patterns of dependence, approval-seeking, and emotional compromise. Carl Jung emphasized that those who integrate their unconscious bring new order to their lives. This woman, by stepping away from validation, is integrating her desires, her fears, her energy, and her body. She is no longer fragmented, no longer dependent, no longer governed by others' perceptions. She becomes whole, and wholeness is magnetic. It draws attention, not because she seeks it, but because presence always does. And in this presence, she discovers something even deeper, the ability to love without need, to connect without dependence, to be intimate without losing herself. This is the paradox of transformation. By refusing to seek sexual validation, she becomes more capable of authentic connection. She no longer confuses attachment with love, desire with identity, or attention with worth. She learns to engage with the world from a place of fullness rather than absence. As this process continues, she begins to embody an archetype, the archetype of the woman who has reclaimed her energy, her body, and her soul. She is intuitive, sovereign, and powerful. She is a living example of what Jung described as individuation, a complete integration of the conscious and unconscious self. And her presence becomes a quiet revolution, a challenge to anyone still living in halves, still seeking approval from the outside, still dependent on validation to feel worthy. This archetype is not only transformative for herself, but also for others around her. Those who are ready can feel it, absorb it, and be inspired by it. Those who are not may feel unsettled, confused, or even intimidated. But she does not respond to their discomfort. She continues on her path, guided by internal truth rather than external approval. And the lessons she learns are profound. She learns that desire, when untethered from validation, becomes creative, expansive, and sacred. She learns that sexual energy, once scattered in the search for attention, can now fuel personal growth, emotional depth, and spiritual awakening. She learns that boundaries are not walls, but sanctuaries. That refusal is not rejection, but clarity. That patience is not passivity, but power. Carl Jung also spoke about the collective unconscious, and she begins to see her journey as part of something larger. By reclaiming her energy, she challenges outdated narratives about women, sex, and validation. She becomes a beacon, not because she seeks followers, but because her presence lights a path for those who are ready to awaken. She embodies a truth that is often uncomfortable, but deeply necessary, that a woman's value is inherent, not conditional, and that the deepest fulfillment comes from alignment with oneself rather than from others. And so, she walks this path with intention. Every choice, every pause, every boundary is a conscious act. She no longer seeks to please, to attract, or to perform. She simply exists, and in that existence, she discovers freedom, power, and clarity. She understands that the journey of stopping the search for sexual validation is not about denial or repression, but about liberation, awareness, and self-possession. This is the transformation that few see, but many feel. It is a subtle, profound, and irreversible shift. The woman who has stopped seeking sexual validation is no longer governed by external expectations. She is free. She is whole. She is alive. And in that aliveness, she discovers a new kind of intimacy, not with others first, but with herself. As she continues to inhabit her own presence, she begins to notice subtle shifts in the way the world interacts with her. Carl Jung would describe this as the integration of the self manifesting externally. People are drawn to her, but not because she seeks attention. They are drawn because she radiates alignment, authenticity, and depth. There is a resonance that comes from wholeness, a kind of magnetic energy that cannot be faked or imitated. Her relationships change naturally. She no longer seeks validation through sex or attention, so interactions are no longer transactions. She no longer gives herself in pieces, in compromise, or in fear of being alone. Instead, she engages consciously. She allows only connections that respect her boundaries, honor her presence, and meet her in fullness. Every conversation, every touch, every glance becomes intentional rather than habitual. And this is where she discovers another profound truth, that intimacy, when approached from wholeness, is far more powerful than desire ever was when driven by need. She realizes that true intimacy begins with self-acceptance, self-awareness, and self-possession. It is not about filling emptiness, but about sharing abundance. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as a journey toward wholeness, and she embodies that principle fully. Her body, her mind, and her soul operate in harmony, creating a space where love, connection, and even sexual energy are no longer distractions, but expressions of alignment. She also begins to notice her own energy in ways she never did before. The energy that was once scattered in the pursuit of validation is now concentrated, powerful, and intentional. Her emotions are clear, her thoughts are sharp, and her instincts become trustworthy guides. Where she once questioned herself, she now trusts herself. Where she once sought approval, she now grants it to herself. Where she once feared being misunderstood, she now holds her truth steady, knowing that clarity requires no explanation. This newfound awareness transforms how she approaches desire, love, and connection. She no longer confuses lust with worthiness, attraction with validation, or attention with significance. She sees clearly that true fulfillment cannot be borrowed from someone else. It can only be cultivated within. And in this cultivation, she discovers a radical form of freedom. Freedom from judgment, freedom from expectation, and freedom from compulsion. Carl Jung taught that shadows not faced return as fate. In learning to stop seeking sexual validation, she confronts these shadows head-on. She acknowledges the parts of herself that once felt unworthy, unseen, or incomplete. She integrates them, transforming fear into insight, pain into wisdom, and absence into presence. The parts of her that were once fragmented now operate in harmony, creating a coherent, grounded, and sovereign self. And the effects ripple outward. The woman who has stopped seeking validation affects everyone around her. She challenges old dynamics. She unsettles habitual patterns. She illuminates the unconscious agreements people unconsciously make about attention, desire, and worth. She is not confrontational, but her very presence exposes what is often denied in others: the need for self-alignment, the absence of integrity, and the cost of seeking approval externally. At this stage, she also discovers patience in a new form. She no longer rushes into relationships, encounters, or decisions. She understands that presence requires time, reflection, and intentionality. The urgency that once drove her to seek external validation has dissolved. In its place is a steady rhythm of awareness, where every choice is measured not by fear or desire, but by alignment with her own energy. She learns that boundaries are not barriers, but declarations. Saying no is not rejection, but clarity. Walking away is not loss, but protection. Silence is not emptiness, but a sanctuary for her soul. And in this sacred space, she cultivates a level of freedom, power, and discernment that most people only glimpse in dreams. Carl Jung would call this the embodiment of the self, the point at which conscious awareness and unconscious wisdom merge into wholeness. And in this wholeness, she discovers the ultimate paradox. By refusing to seek sexual validation, she becomes more accessible in the ways that truly matter. Her presence is not closed or distant. It is full, alive, and awake. She can love deeply, engage profoundly, and connect authentically without losing herself. This is the power of self-possession. This is the freedom of sovereignty. This is the life that emerges when a woman stops defining herself by the attention of others. And yet, she also recognizes the challenges. Society still places value on external validation. Old patterns, external pressures, and outdated beliefs about women and desire continue to circulate. She notices the discomfort in others, the attempts to pull her back into familiar scripts, and the subtle judgments aimed at undermining her presence. But she does not flinch. She has learned that these reactions are reflections of what others have yet to integrate in themselves. She continues her path, anchored in self-awareness and guided by inner truth. Every day, she practices a kind of sacred alchemy. She transforms longing into understanding, absence into insight, and desire into energy that serves her growth. She embraces solitude not as punishment, but as a laboratory for the self. She understands that the most powerful connections, sexual, emotional, or spiritual, cannot flourish in the absence of inner alignment. And in this realization, she steps fully into a new archetype, the woman who is whole, sovereign, and free. This archetype is revolutionary. It challenges dependence on validation, redefines intimacy, and restores agency to the woman who has historically been taught to seek worth externally. And the impact is profound. Those who interact with her are invited to reflect, awaken, and confront their own unconscious patterns. She becomes a catalyst not through force, but through presence, clarity, and alignment. And so, she continues her journey, fully aware of the internal work, the external challenges, and the sacred responsibility of self-possession. She no longer seeks validation. She no longer chases desire. She no longer compromises her energy. Instead, she chooses herself every single day. Carl Jung would say that the individuation process never truly ends, but each stage brings deeper awareness, greater clarity, and stronger alignment. And this is the stage she has reached, the stage where sexual energy, attention, and desire no longer dictate her worth. They are tools, expressions, and opportunities, but never definitions of who she is. She has discovered that wholeness begins within, radiates outward, and transforms every aspect of life. And in this realization, she becomes untouchable, not in the sense of isolation, but in the sense of sovereignty. She is a living testament to the power of presence, awareness, and self-possession. She no longer seeks validation because she knows her own worth. She no longer fears being alone because she has found the most important companion herself. And in that presence, she experiences freedom, clarity, and the ability to engage with the world in ways that are conscious, intentional, and aligned with her deepest truth.